Hi, everyone. Hello, and a very, very warm welcome to all of you here today on my podcast. Well, we've been away for a while and there has been a brief hiatus, but we are back again with podcast 5 with a very special guest today. I'm your host for the evening. My name is Shweta and I'm an architect and principal and founder at Studio Miraki, which is an architecture and design firm based in New Delhi, Noida. So, we're going to have a lot of conversation today regarding architecture, design, and human psychology. So, well, let me introduce my guest today. He is an architect, a researcher, an educator, and a pioneer in the field of architectural psychology. He is an architectural psychologist and a professor of design at the School of Architecture, University of Nevada. He has a PhD in environmental psychology with various degrees in community psychology, architecture, as well as health sciences. He has championed five very important books on the field of psychological and physiological health and its role in a person's overall well being. We welcome Dr. Dak Kopec on this podcast today. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Kopec. How are you doing?
Thank you for having me. This is fantastic. I'm doing well actually. Today is a holiday here in the
Oh,
United
nice.
States, so it's a nice and relaxing day for all of us.
Well, I hope I can have a lot of takeaways, and our viewers can also have a lot of. I'm sure we can spark a lot of thoughts and conversations in the minds of our viewers today in the design and the architectural fraternity. So, well, diving straight into the podcast, Dr. Kopek, before we get into your work and your philosophy, which I have thoroughly studied in the past few months. Uh, I would just like to take you back to the beginning a bit, as in, what exactly drew you to this field of architecture and environmental psychology? Was there any particular experience or any turning point in your life, or how did you gravitate towards this particular field of studying human behavior and design?
Well, that's a really good question because I came to architecture kind of through the side door. Most people know what they want to do when they're very young, and I didn't know what I wanted to do because I didn't have a name for what I was interested in. So I like to say that rather than going through the front door of architecture, I kind of snuck around to the backside and crawled through the window and said, "Hey, here I am." But all kidding aside, as I said, I've always known there's a relationship between the environment that surrounds us and our health and our behaviors. Where did that come from? One can only guess, but I suspect that a lot of mine came from the fact that I grew up having really bad asthma. And I grew up during a time when we didn't have the pharmaceuticals that we have today. So we relied almost 100% on my environment to control the asthma. So, I mean, that meant things like, in the 1970s, I couldn't have a shag carpet, which was popular back then. I couldn't go outside during windy times because I would end up with an asthma attack. So I've always known that there was this relationship, but I never really put my finger on what it was. And through exploration, as you've said, you've read off my CV. I thought maybe health sciences, then I thought maybe community psychology, then I found environmental psychology, but how was I going to put that into practice? And so that's when I found architecture and interior design. So it's been kind of a meandering path.
Oh, well, your experience reminds me of a certain case study that I recently read about in Richmond, UK, in which there was a similar problem being faced by a family where their children were suffering from extreme allergies and asthma. And instead of going to a lot of doctors, or probably doing their that whole circle of going through a lot of hospitals and doctors and injections and medication, ultimately they decided to build a new house for themselves. And how they built it with low toxicity materials and the kind of air conditioning, ventilation, how ultimately they could filter out the contaminants. And there's a very interesting case study that's been recently done. So yes, I just got reminded of that. So yeah,
Yeah.
that's interesting to know.
Mm.
Well, Dr. Kopek, I mean, I've seen a bit of your work. I've heard your TED talk as well, which is very interesting also. So your work has shown that how spaces influence our emotions, our behavior, even trauma recovery. Um, so what do you think in rapidly growing cities like, say, ours, for example, New Delhi, India? How do we incorporate psychological well-being into this very dense, complex, and already resource stretched environments?
Yeah, what you're asking for is kind of like the holy grail of design. How do we incorporate all of those things? I think the first step is always going to be in the planning of the city. I think there needs to be a master plan with goals and objectives that the majority of the population can agree upon. But one of the things that I've noticed just throughout my own personal experience is that if you can take a larger city and segment it into smaller villages or smaller communities, those can be more manageable, and you can have an elected official within that particular area when it's smaller like that, where people have access to the people and then or to the leaders, and those leaders then can funnel the information up. So I like the idea of segmentation, and also because it promotes attachment. So if you segment the community of New Delhi, for example, and you give it a name, whatever name that is, XYZ, people start to attach to it and like, oh, I'm from XYZ. And they start incorporating the place into their identity. Once they incorporate the place into their identity, they're more apt to be proactive to protect that place or to help elevate that place. But I do have to caution, you and everybody else to realize that many of our cities today are the size of countries
Mm.
about 100 or 200 years ago. So the type of density in the populations that we have today, we've never seen in human history. So in many aspects, this is a great experiment that we are engaged upon.
Yes, I truly agree. Dr. Kopek, have you ever been to India or New Delhi or any other city?
I have not. I have never been to India.
Okay, I think you should visit soon then.
I would love to come to India, but I've never been. Yes.
Okay. Oh, I understand what you're talking about, the concept of segmentation and community and leadership, and I mean, I think it's a great takeaway for all of us here. So, from here we move on to, once we've talked about how we can tackle this problem at the city and the community level, if we talk about, say, the space level or the building level, could you walk us through some, say, design features or, say, strategies that you've come across, say, in your work or someone else's work that you really think supported the psychological and emotional well-being of the users, and what made those features stand out to you?
Well, I think a lot of this depends on the region, and so I'll get into that in just a moment. But one of the places that I really like, and I like it because of multiple factors, and that is the walkability that's happened with the Highline Park in New York City. Now, I don't know if you're aware of it, but it's a raised former railroad track that was converted into a pathway and was walkable. What I like about it is that it accomplishes a couple of different things. One of the reasons that people don't like to walk outdoors is there's this innate fear, whether it's at a conscious or subconscious level, that they're going to get hit by a car. So, when you're on the same level as automobiles or other things that could cause harm, you're going to want to put yourself away from that whatever it is, that fear. But more importantly is I see it as a metaphor. And I like the idea of pedestrians being above the automobile, pedestrians being superior to the automobile. I like that metaphoric relationship that happens there. As far as projects and buildings, I have to say that I've been working on a project in Phoenix for a trauma care center. And the thing that I really like about that particular project is that the city council, the police department, the counselors are all invested in trauma informed design. So every aspect from arriving in the first signage that you see to the parking lot and how you actually enter into the building and the things that you encounter, every aspect was trauma informed design first, and then we designed the environment, the interior environment around that, and then the envelope got developed after that. So, as you know, as an architect, you often start with the envelope, work on the interior, and then the people. But this was different. It actually looked at the problem, not the problem, but it looked at the situation first, and then from the situation, we developed the interior, which then informed the design of the exterior.
Well, that's very interesting to know because I also believe that in a lot of cases that should be the way it should be, rather than you make an exterior facade and then you're trying to fit in everything accordingly. That doesn't really work. I think what you're saying is the very correct approach to go about it, especially in very sensitive zones like the one you are talking about right now. Oh yeah, that's pretty interesting.
Well, I think that, it's you had said something that just really kind of triggered me to think of it, and it just kind of fell out of my head. But yes, when it comes to special populations, so whether you're designing for Alzheimer's disease or you're designing for kids with autism, or trauma, any one of these, you really need to be thinking about the person first. And this is now I remember what I wanted to say is that when you build with the envelope first and then you do the interior design and then you put the person in there, you're force fitting everything. You're trying to force fit the interior into the envelope. And now you're trying to force fit the people into the interior space. So that's why I like the other aspect or the other way to do this. And again, I don't know that it works for every single situation, but when you're working with special populations, it should be the way to go.
Yeah, totally agree.
Yeah.
um Well, I know that you do a lot of work on gender inclusivity as well. So you've spoken about a lot about the design of spaces that are inclusive of the gender diverse users in the population. Do you see space as a tool for social justice, or do you feel that can design itself act as a form of quiet activism? What's your take on that?
Well, I think that all spaces should be inclusive to the populations that they serve. Um, I think oftentimes we look at spaces from a masculine perspective or a feminine perspective. And then sometimes we often look at them from a specific cultural perspective. And when you're in a culturally diverse area, as we are in Las Vegas, we have to be thinking about the different cultures and how is it that they're being represented within the built environment, because we become attached to places when we feel comfortable. Well, when we feel comfortable is when we feel like we're part of it. And we feel part of it when we have command and control of the different spaces. And we see ourselves reflected some way, somehow in the overall design. Now, that could be a statuary, that could be artwork, could be mosaics, but we all need to see ourselves being reflected within that community. When you don't see yourself reflected, you don't feel a part of it. And so, you end up with separations within society. So that's where I think that inclusivity needs to play a role. As far as activism, oh, definitely. Architecture has can play a huge role in activism. And really, what activism is it's breaking the normative expectations. So we have an expectation of what a community is going to be like or what it's going to look like. And you take that notion and you challenge people's ideas or concepts. One thing that I've often thought about for architectural activism would be, wouldn't it be great to put a homeless shelter right in the middle of Wall Street? Wall Street in New York City is the heart of capitalism. It's money, 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 money. Now let's put a homeless shelter in there as a juxtaposition. That's social activism. That's making people see that there is an other side to hypercapitalism.
Well, that's quite thought-provoking, I must say. Never imagined something like this.
Well, I mean, take a look at any one of our very um, strongly uh, gravitating towards a particular culture or something, and then say to yourself, okay, well, what's the opposite to that? So in Wall Street, the opposite of rich is being poor. So what would you do to bring that in? If you're looking at a community that is a particular ethnicity, what's the opposite ethnicity? So can you pull that in? So I think that there are ways to challenge people's ideas and concepts by exposing them to the alternate aspect of it. And that's really where education takes place. Because, 9 times out of 10, you ask somebody who's very prejudiced for whatever reason, and then they go and they meet somebody who is whatever that is. And they're like, oh, but that person's just such a nice person and we got along so great. That's education, and 9 times out of 10, if we know, then we're gonna behave better. At least that's my hope anyway.
Yeah, let's hope for that. But how do you think is how difficult is this to implement in a real world scenario?
Activism or just taking the particular notion. I think that it has to be somewhat I think it has to be somewhat subversive, and that's where the young people come into play because then they challenge, and they're not as um, uh, quick to get into trouble. Doing something as macro, like putting a homeless shelter in Wall Street, is probably not going to be realistic.
Yeah.
But there are other things that you can do that are a little smaller, but they have to have a sense of permanence. And I think that that's the important part, is that, whether it's a mosaic that is made with tile that's put into the entryway flooring of the local courthouse that communicates something, that's not so easy to tear up and to replace. Taking a poster down is pretty easy, or removing a billboard is pretty easy. But when you start incorporating things like statuary into the design of the building itself, it's a little bit harder to do that. And you take a look at like the Chrysler building, for example. That's a testament because you can see the radiator caps on there as well as the hubcaps. It's all incorporated into the building. And what I think is beautiful about that is that it was it was reflective of the culture and the people of that time. But now we're looking at it almost 100 years later, and it's telling me a story of my people and what they believed and what they thought. So it becomes an educational component into the greater dialogue of who we are and where we've come from.
Well, yes, makes me think also about a lot of things. Yeah.
That's a good thing, right?
Yeah, surely. Talk about education and young people. I know that you've taught in architecture, medicine, psychology, design. So, do you think that architectural education needs a major shift? Of course, I'm sure you would have a radical answer to that as well. But till date, at least in India, I don't, s- I don't see psychology or the study of human behavior become very core to the curriculum. Is that the same with you as well? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that in the United States, there are more people that are advocating for human factors within the curriculum, and we see a lot of the larger firms actually hire somebody who can assume that role of dealing with the human factors. But I do worry sometimes when I look at some of the when I look at some of the designs and they're being hailed as being good for whatever.
Human
And
centric.
yeah, I can see where the problems come from, and I'm like, well, that was kind of, but you kind of missed the mark. Or yeah, that would have been great for Minnesota, but not Arizona. Because Minnesota being snow country and gets dark really early. Phoenix or Arizona being desert and really hot. So, we tend to look at standards because it's just such a big thing to think about. I mean, when you think about architecture, you're thinking about design, you're thinking about engineering, you're thinking about technology. There's so much to think about when you're designing a building that I think the human component, the human factors ends up becoming a, yeah, 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 we understand that kind of a thing. And it gets kind of pushed to the side when, for me personally, and again, I think it comes from my background, I think the human factors is the first thing that you think about because they're the ones who are going to be occupying the building. Um, so I don't think that I don't think we're too far ahead of you in terms of that, but I do think that there are quite a few firms that are specifically looking for that. And I look forward to the day that we see people who are specifically trained in environment and behavior, whether that's environmental psychology or whatever, that are in the universities teaching future architects and interior designers. Because when I look at the project, I see the person first. The design is second. Most of my architecture colleagues, and they'll say that all the time, they'll look at the design first and the person second. So,
Yeah, yeah, I totally agree with you. When we get a project, then you always have, like you also said, there's this complicated jargon word. There's architecture, there's engineering, there's sustainability, there's material, there is complicated technology now. So I think we just kind of everybody's just burdened under the weight of these heavy words, and something as basic as the user who's going to use the space is kind of sidelined. That okay, let's just sort out the other things first, kind of an approach,
right.
just like a half-baked approach. But then
It,
you have people
it's
like
a tough,
you.
it's just really a tough thing for firms because there are so many things, and it's tough for education too. That I'm a big proponent of bringing somebody from the outside as a consultant because when you bring somebody from the outside, people tend to listen to them a little bit more than you listen to somebody who comes from out there versus somebody that's already in your house. It's kind of
Yeah.
like your family.
Exactly.
Um, but the other aspect is that they stay singularly focused. So, like with all the projects that I work on, when I come in, I know that the design team has all been working and I come in and I specifically look at things, but I'm looking at them from only one perspective. and enables, I think, the project to be much better than if I were trying to think of the big picture. And then the designers figure out either A, how to make an adjustment, or we have to do a cost benefit, analysis, and we look at probabilities and stuff like that. For example, if you've got a woman who's been traumatized and she sees somebody and she starts running and she looks behind her and she runs into a cactus. Is that probable or not? Well, it depends on where the cactus is. If the cactus is pretty close to the walkway, there's a greater probability. But if you sink the cactus further into the central area, then the probability becomes less. So these are the things that I bring to the table, that this type of thinking, as a consultant.
Well, that kind of sensitivity is pretty hard to come by these days, I would say. And I totally agree with you that it's on the big table. I think each task is allocated to a consultant, like a specialized consultant. And then there is the architect or the designer who can kind of become the captain of the ship and kind of stitch the whole fabric together for
Yeah.
the user at the end of the day, is what I understand. Okay,
Yeah,
so
I think that that's a great thing, and I think that's the beauty of architecture, interior design, landscape architects, is that they're really good at taking all these people, all these ideas and stitching them
that job.
together, as you say. And I think that's
And
great language.
yeah, we kind of, I think years of training of just kind of leading a team and getting things done, stitching the fabric, as I said. Uh,
Yeah, absolutely.
So, for all the young architects tuning in, a lot of students would also be listening to this podcast. So, in places like India, as I said, that the education systems can at times be very archaic and rigid. What do you suggest that what mindsets or habits should they adopt if they want to truly design for people and not just buildings?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. First and foremost is never make an assumption. Um, and I think that becomes, a big deal and I see it here in the United States where people think, oh, Americans, and they lump us all together. Having been born and raised in Massachusetts and in the Boston area and then moving to Los Angeles, I can tell you that they're very different. The cultures, the values are very different. And so make you can't make people standardized. And so I think that standards help, but you can't standardize the people. So that's where I think you got to be careful with the assumptions. Um, but having said that, I would recommend that they become good people watchers. Really observe
Observation.
people. I'm sorry?
Good observation.
Well, great observations. Really watch the people, see how they're acting, see what they're doing. If you see somebody who's up high and they've got white knuckles because they're holding onto the bar as they look, you know that they're afraid of heights. And so you're like, I wonder how they would respond if they couldn't hold on to that bar. Would they take 3 steps back, or, how would that work? Now, if I make that glass, what would that be like? On a logical level, I know nobody can go through the glass, but because I can see through it, my my panic or my fear is, oh my God, my dog or my child's going to fall off because you can see right through it. So you almost like need that visual barrier in some cases. That's an observation thing that you pick up on. When you're looking at designing for special populations, I can't tell you how many YouTube videos I watch, people telling me their stories, and I listen, but you got to be careful with that because what ends up happening is people start looking at social fixes, not environmental fixes. And so you've always got to ask yourself, well, what does this mean for design? What does this mean for the building, the layout, the furniture, the materials, and take a look at what they've got, So like if you're doing something for autism, for example, take a look at the furniture that they've got in there. And are they talking about somebody that they're having a lot of problems with? And do you see a lot of patterns? But then you see another one and you see that there aren't as many patterns. And you're like, well, I know that people with autism tend to be overstimulated. The patterns are probably causing the overstimulation for this one. But again, we're dealing with a lot of things that haven't been all researched, and so we're really looking at probabilities and I don't want to say guesswork because it's more of research, observational guesswork, because you're starting to say, well, if this is like this, then it should be like this. Every action has an opposite and equal reaction. And so we've got to always think like, okay, if I do this, what are those reactions going to be like?
And you used a term called social fixes.
Yes.
What can you elaborate a bit on that, please, as to what exactly are you referring to as social fixes?
Social fixes are usually policies. So management won't allow them. A social fix might be like in health and well-being. They'll say, put a basket of fruit or make sure that there's fresh fruit available on the counter. Make sure that there's coffee or something. We as designers don't design that. We can design the counter
Right.
and we can design a place for the refrigerator,
Okay.
but the owners of the building are the ones that ultimately decide what's going to happen in
Right.
that space. So we have to realize that we're not designing the CEO and what he or she is going to say is allowable or not allowable.
Agree. Very well said, Dr. Kopec. Um, well, I've seen, as I said, you've worked globally, say from Hawaii to Germany, and what lessons have stood out that could empower architects working all over the world?
Well, I think that you really need to understand the people, and you look at you mentioned Hawaii. Hawaii has a strong sense of community, and they're very proactive about recapturing a culture that was almost eradicated through colonization. So, culture and heritage are very important to the Hawaiian people. And to go in as a firm who doesn't know that and they're just designing a building that is, going to get them on the cover of a glossy magazine isn't going to resonate well with the people. Um, so you really have to understand who they are and what their situations and circumstances are. You take a look at some of the former Soviet nations, like the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. They've got a lot of historic areas, but they've also got a lot of um, disruption of some of their historics by Soviet regime during the days of the Soviet Union. So when they're looking at something just as simple as accessibility, you're really dealing with a lot of problems as to how to make that building accessible, particularly if it was built in the 15th century, or they've now have new ways to come into play. So like I'm thinking of like the Soviet being very functionalist in the way that they would do things. So they would make like really small areas, and sometimes you'd have to climb up through with a ladder as opposed to the stairs, because it's a very functionalist type of society.
Hmm. Well, um, well, as I come to the end of this podcast, Dr. Kopek, thank you so much for sharing such a rich perspective with all of us here. And I'm sure it sparked a conversation within me, within you, all of our users, and it's been extremely engaging, extremely enriching. Thank you so much, Dr. Kapek, for joining us today. And as when this podcast comes out, I would urge you and everybody to share this and let us know how do you feel about this podcast and the work we're doing, so we can help get more insightful voices onto your feed. So till then, this is your host Shweta signing off and looking forward to another episode, another conversation with all of you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Kopec. Have a very nice day.
Thank you very much. You have a great night too.